Well, good morning. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 37 this morning. Genesis 37. We're in this series on forgiveness, and every single one of us knows how extremely hard it is to forgive, especially those who have been so violently violated. So the idea of forgiveness is something as a Christ follower that we really want to do, we just don't know how. And the thing I've been trying to do in this series is to get us where we are now is to kind of picture it this way. Picture that you build this small house and you have the foundation and you have, let's say, 4 pillars and then you put on the roof. Well, the length of time that roof stands is dependent on how strong those pillars are. So maybe you're thinking this series, well, Jeff, why don't you just get on with this and tell us how to forgive people? Well, I'd like to do that, but we just can't, and I'll tell you why. These 4 pillars have to be built. And you have to understand the role each one of these play. Once the 4 pillars are put in place, then you can put the roof on. And then I can say, in the next 2 weeks, here's how you forgive. So if I go straight to it of here's how you forgive, then without those 4 pillars, it just won't work. And that's why most of us have struggled with this all our lives, to forgive somebody who has offended us. See, according to the Bible, it tells us that forgiveness is something that we are commanded to do. Now, I didn't say it's natural, because it's not. It's very unnatural to do, but because we've been forgiven a massive amount of debt, it's something that we're supposed to do and be able to do. Now, I think this message this morning is something that's going to help us, because it's a narrative story from Genesis chapter 37 that you've probably heard all your life, but I think it will help you learn how to forgive. So let's look at what Joseph and his brothers went through here. Verse 17 says, "They have moved out from here." The man answered, "I've heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance, and before they reached him, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and to take him back to his father. And when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it, and they sat down to eat their meal, and they looked up and saw a caravan of the Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and says, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" They got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in blood, and then they took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It's my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So everything we see that happened to Joseph is a result of his brothers selling him into slavery, or so it seems. For 9 years, he's going to serve as a slave in the house of Potiphar. He's 17 years old when all this begins. And this is a time when young men dream dreams, and they start trying to find their place in this world. Or, what's my purpose? Why am I here? But at the age of 17, Joseph's brothers killed his dreams. The problem is, we read this story and we think how successful Joseph was. After all, he's Potiphar's slave, but he's very well respected in Potiphar's house. But that's true, but make no mistake, Joseph is still a slave. He's not an employee. He's told when he can eat, when he can sleep, when he can work, when he can rest. He has no rights other than the rights that Potiphar gives him. He doesn't get a weekend pass to go into Egypt and enjoy himself. Now, I want you to think about Joseph for a moment. Don't super spiritualize Joseph. I mean, do you not think that it's possible that Joseph is bitter toward his brothers right now? Don't you think he lays in bed at night and thinking, you know what? My brothers, they did this to me. They ruined my life. They sent me away from my home, from my father that I love. I have no hope. I have no future. They robbed me of my life. And it makes you wonder if part of the reason that Joseph wanted to work so hard to win favor with Potiphar was maybe someday he would be free and he can go and get revenge on his brothers. Revenge is a powerful motivator. It's like the story I've heard of a British shock jock over in England by the name of Tim Shaw. And he was working one shift and he made a big mistake. He was interviewing this pinup girl and he told the girl that he was willing to leave his wife and kids for her. Now, minutes later, his wife, Haley, created an eBay auction for her husband's car, this Lotus Turbo. And the auction page was almost completely empty except for a picture of the car with the following words. She says, I need to get rid of this car immediately, ideally in the next 2 to 3 hours before my cheating jerk husband gets home to find it gone and all his belongings in the yard. I am the registered owner. I have the registration. Please only buy if you can pick up tonight. The car was valued at $45,000. She sold it for 90 cents. And the auction lasted exactly 5 minutes and 3 seconds, and an anonymous buyer bought it and drove away. And she was interviewed later, and she says, Mr. Saul said that she was sick of Tim disrespecting his family for the sake of his act. She asked about the price of the car. She says, I didn't care about the money. I just wanted to get back at him. Revenge is a strong motivator. It's a strong emotion that drives us. So I have to wonder, at least in the early stages, was one of the reasons that Joseph was so dedicated to rise up in the ranks was to be able to get out and pay back his brothers. I mean, how bitter would you be if the people that are supposed to love you and to care for you and take care of your well-being betray you and sell you into slavery? Now, by the way, you just have to go back to chapter 34 to see how terrible Joseph's brothers really are. Let me give you an example. They have a sister by the name of Diana. Now, she's raped by Shechem. He's the son of Hamor, the Hittite. And so Jacob's sons, they want to get revenge, and they're cruel about it. So in Genesis 34, it says this. He says, but Hamor said to them, my son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please give her to him as his wife. Intermarry with us. Give us your daughters and take our daughters for yourselves. And you can settle among us. The land is open to you. Live in it, trade in it, acquire property in it. So Jacob's sons lie to Shechem. And they say this in verse 14. He says, they said to them, we can't do such a thing. We can't give our sister to a man who is not circumcised. That would be a disgrace to us. We will enter into an agreement with you only on one condition only, that you become like us by circumcising all your males. Now, these are grown men, and they must have been just infatuated with the Israelite women because they said yes. And so Joseph's brothers wait until the circumcision, and then it says, 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, 2 of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Diane's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. Now that's cruel. That's punishing them first and then killing them. Now they turn all their anger and their terribleness on Joseph. So now when Joseph is most likely bitter toward his brothers, at least at this point, he's not bitter toward God. He doesn't blame God. He's so committed and faithful to God in the midst of all of this. When Mrs. Potiphar starts pursuing him, I mean, think about what he could do, because so many people do it today. He could have said, man, she is so good looking, and you know what? God's not honoring me right now, so why should I honor him? I'm going to sleep with her. But the Bible says Joseph doesn't make those kind of excuses or rationalizations. And the reason that he doesn't give it to temptation, he tells us there in verse chapter 39, verse 9, it says, no one is greater in the house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? He said, I'm not going to do this because it's a sin against my God. And so he's faithful and loyal to his master Potiphar, but even more faithful to his ultimate master, God. Now here's the question. Where does all that faithful get Joseph? He gets thrown into prison. Potiphar's wife, she doesn't give up trying to seduce him. She's determined to take advantage of him, but he runs away in every situation. But this time she grabs a hold of his cloak. He runs out of it, and she takes his cloak to Potiphar, says, Exhibit A, he's been trying to rape me. I mean, he's trying to do the right thing, and what does it get him? Verse 19, it says, when this master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me. He burned with anger. And Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Now, this place is a terrible place. I mean, think about it. If you were Joseph, is your bitterness increasing or decreasing? Well, it's increasing, because now there's probably part of you inside thinking, God, give me a break. Help me out here. I expect this from my brothers, but I did the right thing. Look what's happened to me now. Joseph was probably sitting in that cell just seething and thinking, look, my brothers are the evil ones, and they're prospering. I try to do the right thing, and I'm suffering. I mean, have you ever thought that? Have you ever been there? Joseph ends up spending the next 4 years in prison. And let me tell you something about these Egyptian prisons. There's a large hole dug in the ground and a fortress built around it, and prisoners were treated horribly. In fact, typically what they would do is when you went into prison, they would cut your nose off. In case you ever escaped, people would see you and go, oh, you don't have a nose, you belong to prison. And so they would take you back. There was a small portion of food. Prisoners were expected to die while they were there. Only the young and healthy and strong could survive, but most died. Survival rate was only about 10%, and nobody lasted more than 3 years, but Joseph would spend 4 years in this prison. And he continued to act with great character and integrity. Chapter 39, verse 23 says, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So even though Joseph is experiencing this internal struggle, my brothers have betrayed me, I've been treated unjustly, God, where are you? I keep doing the right thing, but everything seems to get worse. Even though he's going through all this tension on the inside, still on the outside, he continues to do the right thing, which is amazing. Now, what is evident is no matter what Joseph thinks, and we can't get inside of Joseph's head except for one passage, we'll read that in a minute. What you and I know, because we know the whole story, is even if Joseph thinks that God has abandoned him, God is not. The objective truth is no matter what he felt, the fact of the matter is God has no way abandoned him, even though he's in this terrible, terrible prison. Preacher Jeff, are you saying that God would let me go into a terrible situation and still be with me? Absolutely. And what's happening to Joseph was, it stinks. There's hunger, there's abuse, there's slavery. But, he's still a respected slave, but he's still a slave. Then you come to chapter 40. The king's cupbearer and the baker comes on the scene. The cupbearer and the baker have fallen out of the king's graces, and strangely enough, they're thrown into prison with Joseph. Joseph is responsible for their care, and he makes friends with them. Now, the cupbearer and the baker, they have dreams, and dreams in those days meant a lot, because they believed before something played out in your life in the physical, that dreams were given to you by the spirit world. But the problem was there was never a good dream interpreter around when you needed one. So they had this dream, but they didn't know what it meant. So these two men worked for the king. They have dreams that bothered them, and there's no one to tell them what the dream meant. But they tell Joseph. And Joseph tells them in chapter 40, verse 8, we both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. I mean, think about it. Joseph still believes in God, and he knows the power of God, even though he's probably struggling with God right now. Why is God allowing all these terrible things to happen to me right now? And so God gives Joseph this special insight. And it's bad news for the baker, but great news for the cupbearer. The cupbearer is going to be restored, and he will not die in prison. Now, if you're the cupbearer, this is the last place you would expect to find somebody who can interpret dreams. And he tells you, I can interpret your dream. You're going to stand before the king one day, and you're going to get your old job back. The baker is going to get hung, but too bad for him, but it's good for you. Now, if you're the cupbearer, when you get out of prison, you're going to be happy that you met Joseph. I mean, happy that you have been restored. But notice what happens. Chapter 40, verse 14 says, But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." So Joseph lets the cat out of the bag. He says, remember me because I am here unjustly. I don't deserve to be here. I don't deserve to be carried away from my home people. I don't deserve to be placed in a prison and suffer this abuse. And so Pharaoh has a birthday. And just as Joseph said, Pharaoh restores the cupbearer, he hangs the baker. Now, if you're the cupbearer, wouldn't you remember Joseph? But verse 23 says, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Now, the Hebrew word means he literally forgot. It makes me think that God erased that memory at least for a season. I mean, how do you forget something like that? Because the word does not mean, well, he knew about Joseph, he just had more important things on his mind. That's not what it means. It means he forgot, which means Joseph would spend 2 more years in prison during the prime of his life. Now, if you were Joseph, how would you be thinking? You would be thinking, God, I've been faithful to you, but you've abandoned me. I'm trying to do the right thing, but bad things keep happening to me. And if I were Joseph, I would be saying, God, how hard is it to jog his memory? I mean, this is an easy miracle. The Red Sea, the walls of Jericho, planting a thought. I mean, how hard is that? Now, we all have assumptions, and some of those assumptions is when things go wrong in our life, we assume God has abandoned us, that there's no way that God can be with me during these bad things when these bad things happen. In the story of the Count of Monte Cristo, Desmond says, I don't believe in God. And the priest looks at him and says, it doesn't matter. God still believes in you. He's still with you, and he sees something you can't see. Whether we want to admit it or not, most of us think when we do the right thing that it's supposed to turn out well. We should understand that makes no sense because the central theme of Christianity is the cross, where Jesus did everything right, committed no sin, and still suffered and died. Now, everything I described to you happened to Joseph before his 30th birthday. Well, now, what would his view of God be at this point? Because he doesn't see how all of this is going to turn out like we can. And again, don't over-spiritualize Joseph, because we're not reading some myth or legend. This is history. This is real people. So if you think Joseph has not experienced some internal anguish and struggle with God, then you're reading a fairy tale. Look, every single one of us has a burden to bear. Every single one of us has been wounded and abused and betrayed by somebody. And I promise you, all of us has wounded, betrayed, and abused somebody else. So if you think only bad things happen to bad people, that means you're bad people. Well, yeah, Jeff, but I mean, this is really bad, and I'm stuck, and I'm mad at God, and I'm mad at God because why did God not step in and prevent this person from doing this horrible thing in my life because my life is ruined? But every time you go down that path, you should remember what happened to Joseph. 2 years later, Pharaoh sends for Joseph. Why? Because he has some dreams. And now suddenly the cupbearer remembers Joseph. I mean, he couldn't remember him 2 days after, but now 2 years later, he remembers him. Joseph interprets the dreams, and the dream means that Egypt is going to go through 7 years of abundance and then 7 years of famine. So you better prepare for the famine during the time of abundance. Pharaoh's so impressed, he says that Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger, put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in the robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. So Joseph manages the economy from plenty and fathom. And so in doing so, we know he's going to save his brothers. Now, why is all that important? Because if God doesn't save Israel from this famine, then the seed of Abraham will be stifled. The lineage of the Messiah will be ceased, and you and I will be lost in our sins forever. So it's kind of important. God saves an entire nation through the obedience and suffering of one man, which is why we say Joseph is an archetype of Yeshua. But the definitive part of this narrative comes in Genesis chapter 50. Joseph has become the prince of Egypt. And man, does he now have power to enact revenge on his brothers. He has the resources and the means, and I would think the will. And I don't know where it was, but somewhere along the line, Joseph decides it would not be right to exact revenge on his brothers. And part of it has to be with suddenly he's able to stand back and look at his life and connect all the dots. That God was trying to move him from the pit to the palace. That was his journey. Now, I know that still brings up a lot of questions. But when Joseph comes, when his brothers come to meet Joseph for the first time, they don't recognize him. And when they finally recognize him, they are terrified. Because they're terrified because what they would do and what Joseph do is two different things. Joseph is not like them. So chapter 50, Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Now, I want you to notice what happens, and this will help us. This is the fourth pillar of before we go into how do we forgive the next 2 weeks. And he says, the reason I forgive you is because I'm not in the place of God. Now, what does he mean? Basically, what he is saying is, do I get to determine what God chooses or allows or God prevents from coming into your life? Do I have the exhaustive understanding of all things and all the moving parts to know what should be stopped and what should be allowed in order to accomplish the ultimate goal? Now, you and I understand this on a small scale as parents. Sometimes we cause suffering in our kids' lives for the ultimate good. For example, when your kids are little, you know your kids could live on ice cream, candy, chips, and soda pop. They could. So parents have to set healthy guidelines. Well, you can have dessert if you eat your broccoli and carrots. Because if you give them sugar for meals instead of healthy food, you're going to have a battle for years, and every parent knows that the kid's going to outlast you. That's the way it's going to happen. And then you're going to end up killing your kid because you're going to give them diabetes and heart disease at an early age. So you have to inflict a little bit of pain and suffering to have a healthy food for the ultimate good. When I was at Johnson Bible College, we had a rule book. I mean, in my 20s, I hated rules. I hated them with a passion. I mean, your hair had to be above your collar. You couldn't wear shorts in most places. You had to wear a suit and tie to certain meals. You couldn't miss chapel, so many chapels or so many classes. We had a curfew that we had to be in. I mean, I transferred from ETSU. I had a history class. I went to 4 times the entire semester and still got a C in the class. Johnson was strict. And they enforced the rules, and I hated the rules. But they told us, look, we're preparing you for ministry because ministry is hard. And if you don't endure the pain and suffering that we hated, they said, you won't last in ministry, you'll quit. So God knew I needed those professors and that administration because they were forging character early on in my life. Otherwise, I would have quit ministry a long time ago because it didn't go the way I wanted it to. The point is, even in our human understanding, we understand the relationship between temporary pain and the ultimate victory. If we understand that, how much more does God? God knows all the moving parts and what needs to be caused and what needs to be allowed and what needs to be prevented in order to achieve the ultimate goal in this world. Now, how do we apply this to people who experience something that is horrible and to be able to forgive them? We must consider 2 things. First of all, is you have no idea how much evil God prevents every single day and how much evil he has prevented coming into your life. You only know the ones he's let through the door. You don't know all the ones he says, I don't think so. So the question instead of, why does God allow so much evil in my life? Instead, we should ask, why does God allow so much good in my life? We don't know the thousands and thousands of answered prayers that God said yes to those who've prayed for us. For protection, for healing, for prevention of suffering. We have no idea of knowing the times God prevented something tragic from happening in our own lives. The second thing is there's nothing God allows from which he cannot recover. If he does allow something into your life, there's nothing from it that he can't recover from, no matter how bad it is. Because God gave life the first time, will give life the second time, and it's much better. 1 Corinthians 15 says, so will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness and raised in power. It is sown in a natural body, it is raised in a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there's also a spiritual body. So the life he gives us the second time is so much better than the life he gives us the first time. And Paul gives us an analogy in 1 Corinthians 15. He said it's like a seed. One day it dies, it goes into the ground, it decomposes, but when that seed dies, it grows into something magnificent, like say like an apple tree. The seed is not much, but the apple tree with its hundreds of apples is glorious. And he's trying to say to us, whatever you lose in this life, the next life, he will be more than replaced what you've lost. Because the one who gave life the first time will give it a second time in much more abundance. If we could just understand what that means, then that God allows us to endure suffering from time to time if it fulfills his overall plan for the ultimate good. Now, does that mean we like it? I'm sure Joseph didn't like it. Joseph says, am I in the place of God? Joseph says, I would have never allowed my slavery. I would have never allowed my imprisonment. I would have never allowed the cupbearer to forgive me and cause me to spend 2 more years in prison. But God did. Why? And the answer is, you and I know the whole story, to save the world. God was positioning Joseph at the right place at the right time to save his people. And I have to wonder, what did Joseph learn in the pit that helped him in Potiphar's house? What did he learn in Potiphar's house to help him in prison? And what did he learn in prison that helped him in the palace? So each stage was necessary to get him to the point where he could save all of Israel. Now, if you're a skeptic or a critical thinker, you're probably thinking, well, why go through all this? Why not just zap Joseph with all these gifts and be done with it? Or, come on, God, if you're worried about a famine, why does not make it rain? Just rain on Israel. Well, we'll get on that in a second. But here's the second thing. He makes a statement. He says in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Now, in the Hebrew, intended, kashab, means to weave. So God says, you thought you could weave your plan of destruction while I'm weaving my plan of salvation all along. So God wants to weave his plan to get Joseph into Egypt. Why? To ensure the survival of the Israelites, to ensure the lineage of the Messiah and that would come later on. Now, go back to, well, why doesn't God just cause rain to fall on Israel? 2 mistakes you make. Number one, you think God is one-dimensional and he's only working on one plan. But God has multiple plans going on at the same time. He's not just trying to save Israel. He's trying to get the Israelites into Egypt at the same time so he can get them from Egypt into the promised land, so he can show the world this model of how God has a relationship with his people and give them the 10 Commandments. So there's a lot going on here. It's not just to save them from drought. It's to move a whole people group into Egypt, because Exodus comes after Genesis. God is not one-dimensional. He's working on many plans at the same time. Mistake number 2, you and I think God can prevent evil from happening to us while at the same time allowing freedom to accept or reject him, and you can't. God has given us the freedom to receive or reject him, to do what is good or to do what is evil. To maintain that freedom, that you and I have the possibility of choosing him or rejecting him. Once we're committed to giving us freedom, he's committed to giving us freedom to choose or reject him. That means we have choices every single day to do the good or to do the bad. The only way God can remove any potential from evil in your life is, number one, remove free will, which he's not going to do because then he will have to remove love, or just kill us. Some people are not going to use their free will to pursue God. They're going to pursue themselves and wreak havoc on this fellow man. Man is always weaving his plans, but God is always weaving his plans. And the final product always belongs to God and produces the ultimate good. Now, let's head for home here. The grand weaver is always working together what men meant for evil to the ultimate good, which must frustrate the devil to pieces. I mean, think about it. When somebody is raped or abused and then they end up maybe getting a degree in counseling and they minister to others, that must tick the devil off. When somebody has suffered abandonment as a child and ends up caring for the homeless and the poor and the orphan, Satan must get angry. When somebody is betrayed and abused by a parent or a spouse, and again begins to minister to people who do the same thing, the devil must feel like he felt when he nailed Jesus to the tree, only to discover that God had been weaving a plan of salvation all along. I mean, how many times does the devil look at his demons in frustration and says, man, what on earth do I have to do to these people to get them to reject God? C.S. Lewis said, God whispers to us in our pleasure, but he shouts to us in our pain. And when these events come into your life, you're either going to be bitter or you're going to be broken. You're either going to be bitter and you're going to let it destroy you, or you're going to let it break you and you're going to run to God and you're going to say, Jesus, I hate this, heal me. And your journey begins. And if that's true, God's ultimate goal for us is community and fellowship and ultimately heaven, then what should God be willing to do to get us there? Whatever it takes. So if he's been working hard on you and it's not getting through to you, then maybe he has to do some drastic things to open your eyes. Can I ask you, which is worse, temporary suffering or eternal separation from God? Joseph says, am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, and you were weaving your story, but God was weaving his, which brings us to the last thing, the third thing, and that is the result. The result is, verse 21 of chapter 50 says, so then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph forgave them and wished them well. How was he able to do that? Well, Joseph was able to forgive because he realized that God had never abandoned him. God was most present during the most difficult times. He was taking what was meant for evil and using it for the ultimate good. Well, Preacher Jeff, are you telling me that God caused this horrific thing to happen to me? Absolutely not. God hates injustice, and so should you. Should I be thankful for the evil thing that happened to me? Absolutely not. It was evil. Well, what should I be praising God for? That he took what was meant for evil, and he's weaving a story that is meant for the ultimate good. That he's capable of taking the chaos of your life, what the evil one meant for evil, and weaving beauty and pattern and design for it. And I don't want you to make the mistake. Judgment comes on all injustice, even the injustice that God uses. So how can you forgive? You forgive when you see these pillars. When you see that you too have offended many people. When you see how God has forgiven you so much. When you identify with a perpetrator and realize how did they get to this point of evil. When you see how God used it all to bring the ultimate good, and when you consider that maybe, just maybe, God allowed this into your life to shape you, to skill you, and even save you. This morning, we want to give you the opportunity. Maybe you've never accepted Jesus Christ in your life, and maybe you're trying to figure out God out in that relationship with God. It begins with repentance and baptism. And it begins with walking through that door and saying, look, I'm going to start this new life, and I'm going to start this life with the Holy Spirit entering into me and following him for the rest of my life. And again, the invitation is not just for Sunday morning, it's any time. We want to give you that opportunity this morning. Maybe you just need prayer. Whatever the case is, we invite you to come as we sing our invitation song. Let's all stand together.